very happy that on behalf of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I'm able to introduce Ray. Ray leads our disarmament program, Reaching Critical Will, at the UN, providing analysis and advocacy at the United Nations. She's done that. She's done that in an incredible and eloquent and articulate way for a long time. And I knew of her work before I ever met her. And when the first time I did meet her, I was in the US to take part in a walk on mountaintop removal. But such was her reputation that I thought, I can't not go to the WILPF office in New York while I'm here and see if I can meet Ray. And I went to an event where she was talking about the CIPRI figures for that year to a fairly small room, but that was very full of very large men and not very many women in the room. And Ray was just leaning with her back to a radiator with her ankles crossed and speaking in the most arresting way and giving her views on the situation in a very forthright and clear fashion. It was most impressive. But Ray's an activist with a ferocious talent for communicating and for bringing civil society and those that have been directly affected by the things that we are resistant to the table and to the microphone or putting a pen in their hand, as well as being widely published herself. We're all really looking forward to hearing about the new book, which has been described as a first-hand immersive story about the work of activists and diplomats to outlaw nuclear weapons and challenge the nuclear orthodoxy. And it's certainly been a highlight of my life to be a small part of that process. The formal stuff that I'm sure you would be keen to know is that Ray has an honours BA from the University of Toronto in Peace and Conflict Studies and an MA in Politics from the New School for Social Research. They're currently visiting research collaborator at Princeton University's program on Science and Global Responsibility and a recipient of the 2020 Nuclear Free Future Award, the 2019 Pathmaking to Peace Award from Brooklyn for Peace, the 2018 Champion of Change Award from UN Women Metro New York, and the 2018 Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award from Peace Action. So very proud and happy to be part of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the oldest women's peace organization in the world, and to be a co-traveler with Ray Acheson. So over to you, Ray.
Thank you so much, Janet, for that lovely introduction. You said it would be a WILPF introduction, and it definitely was, which I very much appreciate. And thank you to Emily for organizing this, and to all of the Scottish ICANN partners for sponsoring this event, which is the first launch for this book. I'm hoping to do some more talks for various time zones around the world, but this is definitely the first one, and it's really special to me to be doing this with all of you. I wish we were all in a cozy Scottish bookshop doing this, but the nature of the world does not allow that right now. But on the upside, it means we get to have people from all over the world, and I've scanned the participants list already, and there's people in time zones that definitely shouldn't be here. So thank you for staying up or getting up to join us today. And thank you to everybody that has supported this work, the work of nuclear abolition, the work of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and the work of this book, which is also going to be my first full-length book, although I've probably written several books worth of NPT reports and other things over the years. So I've been asked to start with a reading, and this is also another first for me. I haven't done a book reading before. So hopefully we can all pretend that we're in a bookshop in Scotland and have this. And I'm just going to read a few pages from the start of chapter 3, and then I'll talk more about what the book is doing overall, and the state of the anti-nuclear movement, and where I see things going from here with all of our collective efforts. So if that sounds okay, I'm going to start with chapter 3. In July 2017, US Congresswoman Maxine Waters became an internet sensation when she calmly and repeatedly uttered the phrase, "reclaiming my time," to shut down the rambling, sidestepping efforts to silence her of the Treaty Secretary Steven Mnuchin. He was testifying before the US House Financial Service Committee about the state of the international finance system when Maxine Waters asked why his office had not responded to her letter inquiring about President Trump's financial ties to Russia. As the Washington Post reported, Mnuchin tried to sidestep the question with platitudes and compliments, apparently attempting to run out the clock on her questioning. It didn't work. This moment stands out because it resonates far beyond its original context, wrote the Post. Who among us, after all, hasn't lost irreplaceable time to a uselessly meandering meeting, a pointless conversation, or a draining social interaction? Waters' phrase, "reclaiming my time," rang out as a rejection of that made manifest, delighting all of us who have been spoken over, ignored, or had our time wasted by others. Further, the Post pointed out, for many women and people of color, the phrase "reclaiming my time" felt particularly poignant, with the idea of reclamation specifically speaking to both the present and the past. Society has been waiting not only for their time, but also their voices, agency, and potential for years. And why do I tell this story in the book? Well, this is how some of us felt at the 2010 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, when language about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons was successfully included in the outcome document for the first time. A paragraph unprecedented in nuclear weapon agreements expressed states parties' deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and reaffirmed the need for all states to comply with international humanitarian law at all times. It sounds benign, but to have such language included in the outcome of a meeting that historically and habitually controlled by the nuclear armed states to reflect their worldview and their interests was extraordinary. It was a moment of very quiet, very subversive victory for those of us who had spent years or decades working within that sometimes soul-crushing, otherworldly space of nuclear-armed mythologies. For those who have not bought into the falsely obvious beliefs of the magic of nuclear deterrence, talking about nuclear weapons in humanitarian terms in a non-proliferation treaty document was like a glimpse of reality disrupting an otherwise steadfast traditional narrative of unreality. This language didn't come out of the blue. It was based on years of activism and academic research of decades past. The collection of baby teeth in the 1960s proving children across the United States were being affected by nuclear testing in the Nevada desert, scientific studies on nuclear winter and the resulting global famine, books such as On the Beach depicting how radioactive fallout would spread across the globe. All of these provided information about the dangers of nuclear weapons to humanity and our planet. But this was not the dominant discourse at intergovernmental meetings about nuclear weapons. Those meetings were dominated by countries with nuclear weapons talking about geopolitical stability and strategic security. The minutiae of those meetings is rarely reported in the media, but the discussions there set the stage for the policies of Moscow and Washington. The idea that nuclear weapons are essential to security is treated as gospel and justifies the massive investments in these weapons. But that's the thing about discourse shift. You have to be willing to put out unconventional ideas and carefully and methodically build the case for them with the cooperation and in coordination with others. Mainstream discourse on any subject reflects and reinforces relations of power by reproducing accepted ways of being and acting in the world and silencing others. Discourse shapes our understanding of what's appropriate. It sets the boundaries of what can be said and how it can be. It determines truths that control how actors, events, and desired outcomes are defined and interpreted, and what information or knowledge is considered real or legitimate and therefore relevant. Sayla Ben-Habib says that to deconstruct a discourse, one needs to show that what appears as a given is not a natural fact, but a historically and socially formed reality. Discourse can become solidified or naturalized as social facts and thus become resistant to change. But if different interpretations and approaches emerge, the dominant discourse may be able to be splintered. The very act of contesting and challenging dominant narratives helps the splinter, opening up space for change to take shape. New understandings or practices can develop in response to this contestation and splintering. This process can involve rhetorical shifts by powerful players, but rhetoric from those in power, as we have seen, can easily be accompanied by and even serve to mask policies that actually do the opposite. We can't rely on those possessing nuclear weapons to lead the way. Time and history have clearly shown that change would have to come from elsewhere. So that's the reading from chapter 3. I hope that sounds good and makes you want to read the entire book. But now I'll just talk a little bit about the book overall, which is very much about this subject of discourse change that I've just read about, but it's about a lot more than that. It's about why we need to contest and shift these powerful narratives and what it does to nuclear weapon policies in the world. The book overall is a history of the process to achieve the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So it's not about the entire anti-nuclear movement or every effort that's been undertaken to ban the bomb, but about this specific story about the TPNW and how we got there. And there's going to be many different stories and many different perspectives about this process. Lots of people were involved. Everyone would have had a different experience and a different opinion on things. I've attempted to offer a feminist, queer, post-colonial, anti-militarist perspective because otherwise we know that these perspectives are written out of histories or they're diminished in history. They're treated as afterthoughts, lenses that can be applied to understand something. But I actually believe that these values and understandings of oppression and of history and these perspectives were crucial to this process going forward at all. So the book starts with a little bit of history and a little bit of context to the problem of nuclear weapons, and it explains why nuclear weapons have persisted for the last 75, 80 years, explaining the patriarchal, colonial, racist, and capitalist underpinnings of the nuclear weapons system. And it offers a brief overview of global activism against the bomb and international efforts for nuclear disarmament that has been undertaken by diplomats between 1945 and 2010. And it gives the history and some analysis, and it really zooms in on the post-Cold War era, looking at what happened to the anti-nuclear movement from the 1990s on and what challenges we faced at the beginning of this process to ban nuclear weapons through international law. It then sets out how diplomats and activists began agitating for a particular change in 2010. It sets out the strategy of shifting the nuclear weapon discourse, like I was just reading about, from one of deterrence and an abstract security policy to one that focuses on these humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And it describes some of the diplomatic work that was going on this time from our colleagues that work for governments in their attempts to try and achieve nuclear disarmament. There's a chapter in the book called Karaoke and Campaigning, which to some of you that were involved will make a lot of sense, and it might sound strange to others, but it really tries to get to the human and institutional processes that enable the growth of the intellectual ideas and the collective movement to ban nuclear weapons. And so it looks at how we, within ICANN, work to build up interest and capacity with government officials, and how activists revitalized and built a transnational network of campaigners and diplomats to ban the bomb through this international treaty. And it really tries to get to the point that this is all built on human connection, and it's really something we don't hear about in traditional international relations textbooks. You know, these processes and contestations of power happen between states with proper nouns, and I think a lot of it loses the fact that at the end of the day, this work was done by individuals who managed to build up relationships with each other and trust and communication with each other. And this part of the book also looks at some of the struggles that we went through within ICANN as well as some of our key successes. From there, I moved to looking at how diplomats and activists brought the theory of the nuclear ban treaty into the UN. So whilst a lot of this work was going on with ICANN and with certain governments over many years, it was also a big effort to bring it into the United Nations through joint statements that were delivered. Some of you will remember at the General Assembly and at NPT meetings. And there was a series of international conferences that Norway, Mexico, and Austria hosted, all looking at the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and really stigmatizing the bomb as a tool of international security. And so this part of the book shows the importance of the humanitarian discourse in making an intellectual and also a political case for banning nuclear weapons. And it reveals some of the ways in which the nuclear armed states and their allies started to push back against this effort, which is why there's also a chapter about courage in the book, which outlines the growing momentum for the nuclear ban treaty and exposes some of the pressure tactics used by nuclear armed states and by their proxies to prevent the development of this treaty. So this part goes a bit into the weeds of the United Nations and looks at moments when the hostile opposition to the nuclear ban actually managed to foster more support for the treaty. There was a lot of blowback from the arrogance and the racism and the patriarchy of those who were naming their opposition to the ban and really doubling down on their support for nuclear weapons. This whole process really drove more countries towards the ban than it succeeded in pulling away from it. And then finally, the book walks through the actual treaty negotiations. This is sort of the perhaps least interesting to some and most interesting to others, depending on what you're interested in and where you're situated. But I wanted to provide an activist perspective on what actually happened during the negotiations. So it outlines some of the problems and successes with the process and also with the substance of the treaty. And it highlights contributions from activists and survivors, as well as diplomats, and describes some of the challenging points of negotiation, as well as goes through what the treaty actually says and what it all means, what each of the different parts of the treaty mean. And then the conclusion sets out where we go from here, where the nuclear weapon discourse shift and where the negotiation of the ban treaty has taken us, and what we need to do next as activists, as diplomats, as others concerned with achieving a nuclear weapon-free world. And in this part, I try to look a little bit at the relationship of this process, our nuclear abolition process, to other contemporary movements for social justice and for abolition, and offer hope for social change amidst what might sometimes feel like a very hopeless situation in our world. Right now in the UK, you know, things I'm sure feel extra violent right now. We had the kidnapping and murder of a woman, which was followed by the call from the government for more cops, basically, as an answer to that. And I was just hearing today that that has successfully been set back due to activist campaigning, which is great news, but just that that is always the response of the state, right? It's someone is harmed by police, well, then we need more police. We're worried about nuclear weapons. Oh, well, then we need more nuclear weapons. And so that's the other thing that happened in the UK last week, was the announcement that it's going to increase the cap on its nuclear arsenal stockpile by 40%. And it's the exact same philosophy, right, of these two things. It's this idea that the systems and the tools of violence are somehow going to protect us from violence and fear and insecurity. And at the same time, of course, the UK also announced that nuclear weapons get 40% more, but nurses only get 1% more. Because where does the money come from? And so this is our constant fight, right? We know exactly where the money's going to. And it's all about how the patriarchy perceives safety and security as being achieved through power and domination and control and violence, whether it's controlling women or whether it's controlling international relations. And it's then about budgeting for violence, not budgeting for care and well-being and social justice. There's a really excellent article that was put out last week by Millie Lake and Mary Berry, who wrote about the decision to expand policing in order to protect women. And they describe in that piece the colonial models of policing that are designed explicitly to subjugate and repress those often feminized populations whose humanity is explicitly denied. And again, it's the exact same approach to the world, this exact same philosophy that led the UK to test its nuclear weapons on Indigenous lands and people in Australia. It's the same that led the French to not even bother properly calculating or warning people in the Pacific about the fallout from their nuclear tests, which was exposed just a few weeks ago by Sébastien Philippe and others who did an excellent expose on French nuclear testing over French-occupied Polynesia. And it's the same approach that leads to so much violence that are perpetrated against Black and Asian and Muslim and Latinx and Indigenous communities in the United States and elsewhere, which is exemplified most recently. I'm sure many of you saw the attacks in Atlanta, where a white cis hetero man gunned down Asian women that were working in a massage parlor. So this, in turn, this violence, again, against Asian women in the United States, as many amazing Asian anti-war activists have pointed out, derives from US policies of bombing Asian countries. And that includes Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II, but also Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Its military bases in Okinawa and Korea, where the US military has created an entire sex industry to service its soldiers. And all of this violence that I'm talking about, not just the practices of violence, but policies, these are official governmental policies, are cut from the exact same cloth of white supremacy and patriarchy, of this idea of militarism as power. And it's why our resistance to white supremacy and police and prisons and surveillance and border imperialism and war and occupation and nuclear weapons and capitalism, particularly as these can be framed as all demands for abolition, that we can find strength and learning and solidarity amongst each other. And that is a subject of my next book, which will hopefully be forthcoming from Haymarket, but it's also bound into to this book and the ideas that I try and draw forth with this book, that is not just about banning the bomb, it's also about smashing the patriarchy, and it's about abolishing the systems and the structures and the ideation of violence as power and as superiority in our world. So I really hope that it's a tool that is useful for anti-nuclear activists, of course, but also to other folks working on other projects of abolition and social change, because it is a story about how a bunch of us on this call, came together with diplomats who cared and made a new international law, even though the most powerful, heavily armed countries in the entire planet said that we could never do this. And all of the extremely well-funded think tanks in the United States and the UK and France, they said we couldn't do this. And we did it anyway. So I think it's a really great, heartful story of trying something that worked. The story is far from over, as we know. We still have to eliminate nuclear weapons. We still have a lot of other work to do along the way. But it is a moment to be celebrated that is a shared victory for so many people around the world that have spent so long working for this kind of change, which is so urgently needed in our world. So I'm going to stop there and happy to take questions or comments from anybody.